It is late May 1944. In a farmhouse south of Rome, General Harold Alexander stands over a map of central Italy. His arrows all point at one thing: Valmontone on Route 6, the main escape route for the German 10th Army. Alexander commands the Allied armies in Italy. If his plan works, German forces pulling back from the Gustav Line will be cut off and broken south of Rome. Far to the north, Winston Churchill is waiting for proof that his soft underbelly strategy in Italy is finally paying off. Alexander's order is simple: drive hard for Valmontone, cut Route 6, try to trap the German 10th Army. Within days, that plan will change. American troops will turn toward Rome instead, and the German 10th Army will escape. Decades later, historians are still arguing over that choice, whether it was Mark Clark's blunder or a flaw in the whole Italian strategy. If Churchill thought Harold Alexander was his best commander, why did he keep him hidden from the public while Montgomery became the star? Harold Alexander was born into the Anglo-Irish aristocracy in London in 1891. He went to Harrow, then Sandhurst, and joined the Irish Guards just before the First World War. On paper, that background made him look like many other well-born British officers. But the way he behaved under fire set him apart in the memories of those who served with him. He spent most of the war on the Western Front. As a young platoon and company commander, he fought in the retreat from Mons, at Ypres, at Loos, and on the Somme. He was wounded more than once, received the Military Cross for bravery, and later the Distinguished Service Order, and by the end of the war he was commanding a brigade. Officers who served with him later described a particular kind of courage. They said he did not shout or give theatrical speeches. He moved through shellfire in a controlled, unhurried way, made sure his orders were understood, and then moved on. That reserve became a habit. Between the wars, he stayed in uniform, serving in staff posts and in overseas commands. He gained experience in places as far apart as Constantinople and the northwest frontier of India, but he did not seek a public profile. When the Second World War broke out in 1939, Alexander took the 1st Division of the British Expeditionary Force to France. During the German offensive in 1940, he briefly commanded both the division and then I Corps during the retreat to Dunkirk. Later accounts described him as one of the last senior officers to leave the beaches, going only after he had satisfied himself that the final British units had embarked. In Britain, that episode was often remembered as proof that when things were collapsing and someone had to stay calm and get troops out, Alexander could be relied on. Biographers also say it was one of the actions that brought him clearly to Winston Churchill's attention. When Churchill became Prime Minister in May 1940, he faced a war going badly, and a group of senior commanders he did not completely trust. People who worked with him said he liked forceful personalities, valued boldness and the ability to inspire, and could turn sharply on generals whose campaigns disappointed him, sometimes in public. As the war widened, he needed commanders for different kinds of jobs. Some, like Bernard Montgomery, later in the desert, were expected to stand up in front of large formations, project confidence, and serve as symbols of national determination. Others were expected to do something less visible, to keep failing fronts from breaking apart, manage withdrawals and hold alliances together. Alexander was increasingly used in that second role. In 1942, as the war in Asia went badly, Churchill sent him to one of the hardest assignments then facing the British Army. In early 1942, Japanese forces broke through British and Chinese positions in Burma. Rangoon, the main port, could not be held. On March 5, 1942, Alexander arrived to take command of British land forces in the country. What followed was not a victory, and no one at the time expected one, but the way the retreat was handled mattered. Under Alexander at theatre level and General William Slim at corps level, British, Indian, and Chinese units carried out a long and exhausting withdrawal north and west. Rangoon was evacuated in March. Mandalay was abandoned later, and by July the surviving Allied troops had reached India. They left most of their heavy equipment along the roads and jungle tracks, but the field forces were not destroyed. The British official histories and many later analyses emphasized 2 points. First, Burma in 1942 was a serious defeat. Second, given the state of the forces and the pace of the Japanese advance, it was not guaranteed that a coherent fighting corps would make it back into India. Alexander's role in that withdrawal contributed to his image in London as a commander who stayed composed when a front was coming apart. By mid-1942, he was back in Britain, and Churchill now had a different theatre in crisis, North Africa. By the time Alexander returned to Britain, the Desert War had already cost several British commanders their posts. Claude Auchinleck, who was both theatre commander and leader of the Eighth Army, had stopped Rommel at the First Battle of El Alamein, but Churchill was dissatisfied with the overall direction of the campaign. In August 1942, Churchill and his chief of the Imperial General Staff, Alan Brooke, flew to Egypt. Auchinleck was removed. Alexander was appointed Commander-in-Chief, Middle East, and the Eighth Army went to a new commander, Bernard Montgomery. The story that reached most people later was often simplified as Montgomery against Rommel and El Alamein as the Great British Victory. The command structure above that duel was more complicated. Alexander's task was to coordinate not just the Eighth Army, but also the wider build-up of forces for the next phase of the war. After the Anglo-American landings in French North Africa, Operation Torch, he commanded the 18th Army Group, responsible for both the British 8th Army coming from the east and the British-American 1st Army coming from the west in the final push to clear Tunisia. Montgomery planned and fought the Second Battle of El Alamein in October and November 1942. His insistence on careful preparation, heavy artillery, and a set-piece battle on ground of his choosing matched both his own style and the tactical situation. Alexander's role was to make sure that the victory at El Alamein was not wasted, that the Eighth Army pursuit linked up with the new armies landing in Morocco and Algeria, and that the North African campaign moved toward a single aim, the surrender of Axis forces in Tunisia. Inside the British command system, there were different views of him. Alan Brooke respected Alexander's steadiness and loyalty, but sometimes doubted his originality as a strategist. And in his wartime diaries, he portrayed Alexander as a commander with many fine qualities, but limited strategic vision. Churchill tended to focus on other traits. Biographers say he valued the fact that Alexander did not lose his temper, did not argue over every detail, and did not push himself into the limelight. In North Africa, the outcome was clear enough. In May 1943, Axis forces in Tunisia surrendered, and Alexander's headquarters had overseen the closing of the trap from east and west. In British public life, El Alamein and Montgomery became the main symbols of that theatre, but historians note that for Churchill's private judgment of his generals, Alexander's performance as the senior commander in the desert was at least as important. The next stage of the war would test that relationship further. At the Casablanca Conference in January 1943, Churchill argued for what he called a southern strategy. Instead of launching an immediate cross-channel invasion, he pressed the case that the Allies should attack into what he liked to call the soft underbelly of the Axis, first Sicily and then mainland Italy. The phrase suggested that once North Africa was secured, the Mediterranean would offer an easier way into Europe than a frontal assault on northern France. In practice, the fighting would prove much harder than that image implied. For the invasion of Sicily, Operation Husky, Alexander was appointed commander of the 15th Army Group, in charge of both Montgomery's British 8th Army and George Patton's American 7th Army, while Dwight Eisenhower held overall theatre command. On the night of July 9, 1943, into July 10, 1943, more than 180,000 Allied soldiers went ashore in Sicily in what was then the largest amphibious assault of the war. The campaign lasted just over 5 weeks. The Allies took the island, Mussolini was removed from power, and the Italian government began secret contacts with the Allies. The Axis forces, however, were not destroyed. Under cover of German control of the Strait of Messina and well-handled rearguards, tens of thousands of German and Italian troops and much of their equipment were evacuated to the mainland. From London's point of view, Sicily looked like a success with loose ends. Italy was close to collapse and the Mediterranean sea lanes were opening again. But the German army still had strong formations, ready to fight on the peninsula itself. Alexander remained commander of 15th Army Group for the invasion of mainland Italy and the long advance north. His formal brief followed. Churchill's own language: to break Italy, open the Mediterranean, and draw German divisions away from the Eastern Front, and from any future cross-channel invasion. The maps in his headquarters told a harsher story. The peninsula was narrow, mountainous, and easy to defend. River lines and ridges ran across the Allied line of advance. Every move north would be contested. The soft underbelly that Churchill had talked about would prove anything but soft in practice. The Allied landings at Salerno in September 1943, Operation Avalanche, secured a foothold on the Italian mainland but were nearly driven back into the sea before reinforcements stabilized the beachhead. German commander Albert Kesselring made clear in the way he handled his forces that he intended to make the Italian campaign as costly as he could. By late 1943, Alexander's 15th Army Group controlled two main field armies, the British 8th Army on the Adriatic side and the American-led 5th Army on the Tyrrhenian side. The Germans had withdrawn to a strong defensive system across the peninsula, anchored on the town of Cassino and the hilltop Benedictine monastery at Monte Cassino. This Gustav line blocked the most direct route to Rome. From Churchill's point of view, the campaign in Italy now had to justify itself quickly. He had argued to the Americans and to his own cabinet that it would knock Italy out of the war and drain German strength. And people around him later recalled that reports of slow progress and heavy casualties along narrow mountain roads clashed with those expectations. From Alexander's vantage point, the picture was more constrained. He had to work with limited resources, divisions rotated from other fronts, shortages of amphibious shipping, and a constant tug-of-war over priorities with planners in London and Washington who were already concentrating on Normandy. Every attack up a river valley or over a ridge needed artillery, engineers, and air support that could not simply be produced on demand. The battles for the Gustav Line in late 1943 and early 1944, including the repeated attempts to take Monte Cassino, were among the hardest of the European war. Units from Britain, India, New Zealand, Poland, France, the United States, and several other Allied countries suffered heavy losses on those slopes and in the Liri Valley. Alexander's own performance in this period has been debated. Some historians argue that his early plans for breaking the Gustav Line underestimated German staying power and the difficulty of the ground, while others stress that he had to balance political pressure for quick results with the realities of a coalition army fighting in some of the least favorable terrain in Europe. By the start of 1944, it was plain that a frontal grind on the Gustav Line alone would not satisfy Churchill, and that pressure contributed to the decision to attempt one of the most controversial operations of the whole campaign. To break the deadlock at Cassino, Allied planners under Alexander's authority at Army Group level developed Operation Shingle, an amphibious landing at Anzio and Nettuno, about 40 miles south of Rome. The aim was to land a force behind the Gustav Line, threaten the German rear, and force them to move troops away from Cassino. From the beginning, the plan carried obvious risk. The force chosen for the initial landing was relatively small, roughly 2 divisions centered on the United States 3rd Infantry Division and the British 1st Infantry Division, with supporting armor and special units. On January 22, 1944, they went ashore. Within 24 hours, more than 36,000 troops and thousands of vehicles were on the beaches, and the port of Anzio itself was in Allied hands. The German reaction was rapid. Because the landing force did not push at once into the Alban Hills, the high ground that controlled the roads inland, German units were able to move in, contain the beachhead, and then bombard it heavily. The commander on the spot, Major General John Lucas of United States 6th Corps, chose to dig in rather than risk a deeper drive with the troops he had. For weeks, the Allies were confined in a shell-swept pocket. Casualties mounted, and the hoped for quick exploitation did not appear. Responsibility for this outcome has been argued over ever since. Churchill, in his later comments, made clear that he was appalled. He had pushed hard for a bold move in Italy and believed that a rare chance had been wasted through what he saw as excessive caution, and he became sharply critical of Lucas, pressing Alexander to consider replacing him. Alexander, in turn, had to steer a narrow course. He had authorized a hazardous operation with limited forces. He now had to keep the Anzio beachhead holding, fit its operations to the main front around Cassino, and maintain working relations with American commanders whose troops were taking many of the losses. In his official dispatches after the war, Alexander argued that Anzio, despite its grim early months, helped stretch German resources and contributed to the eventual breakthrough to Rome. Some modern historians broadly accept that argument about its cumulative effect, while still criticizing the original plan as under-resourced and the execution as cautious. What Anzio certainly did was deepen a pattern that had already begun to form. Churchill kept seeing in the Italian theatre a series of ambitious ideas that did not quite produce the dramatic results he had hoped for. Alexander, in many accounts, appears as the figure in the middle, personally calm and publicly loyal, but linked in British eyes to a campaign that moved slowly at high cost. The next major offensive, Operation Diadem, would show both the strengths and the limits of that style. By spring 1944, after a series of costly attacks, the Allies were ready for a major effort to break the Gustav Line. Under Alexander's headquarters, they put together a large, carefully coordinated offensive, Operation Diadem. The British 8th Army, reinforced by Canadian, Polish, and other corps, was to attack up the Liri Valley. At the same time, the United States 5th Army, including French and other Allied corps, would strike along the western side of the peninsula. The Anzio force was expected to break out and link up with this advance, cutting off German units pulling back from Cassino. The key to the plan was the small town already marked on Alexander's maps, Valmontone on Route 6. Alexander's written instructions called for Lieutenant General Mark Clark's 5th Army to drive on Valmontone once the breakout from Anzio began. If strong Allied forces could take the town and hold Route 6, there was at least a chance that the German 10th Army withdrawing from the south might be badly mauled. On May 11, 1944, the offensive opened. The final Battle of Monte Cassino was brutal, but by the middle of May, the Gustav Line had been broken. Allied troops pushed up the Liri Valley. From Anzio, 6th Corps moved inland. For a short time, events on the ground seemed close to what Alexander had hoped to see. Then came the disputed change of emphasis. As his troops fought toward Valmontone, Clark shifted the focus of his main effort. Instead of putting maximum strength on cutting Route 6, he moved substantial forces toward Rome. Critics at the time and since have argued that this in practice put the symbolic capture of the capital ahead of the chance of a large encirclement battle. Many Allied officers then, and many historians now, say that this move went against the spirit, if not the letter, of Alexander's orders, and that the German 10th Army got away in better shape than it might have done if the drive on Valmontone had been given absolute priority. Others, looking closely at the ground and the pace of the German withdrawal, suggest that even a stronger thrust toward Valmontone might not have produced the clean encirclement shown on maps, and that Clark was also thinking about the casualties his army had already taken and the political pressure to produce a clear success. What can be stated without guessing at motives is the outcome. On June 4, 1944, Allied troops entered Rome. Churchill now had an Axis capital to announce. 2 days later, the landings in Normandy took place and quickly overshadowed the news from Italy. German forces in the peninsula were badly hit, but not destroyed. They fell back to new lines and carried on fighting for almost another year. For Alexander, Operation Diadem was both an achievement and a disappointment. His armies had broken the main German defensive system and taken Rome, but they had not destroyed the opposing field army to the extent he had hoped. As a coalition commander, he did not attack Clark in public. He accepted the political value of taking Rome, reported what had been done, and turned his staff toward the next stage of the campaign. For Churchill, Diadem underlined that Italy would not bring the sudden collapse he had once imagined when he spoke of the country as a soft underbelly of the Axis. The fighting there had become a grinding and necessary front, but no longer the main focus. In that sort of campaign, Alexander's particular strengths and limits stood out more clearly. While Alexander was struggling with the Italian front, Bernard Montgomery's career was moving on to different ground. After North Africa, he was given command of the 21st Army Group for the Normandy landings and the later campaign in northwest Europe. He had a clear idea of how he wanted his role to be seen. His headquarters put out bulletins and material for the press. He addressed large formations directly, and his appearance, with his beret, badges, and clipped way of speaking, became widely recognized in Britain. When operations went well, that visibility was an asset. After El Alamein and the early stages in Normandy, he was widely praised. When things went less well, as in the prolonged fighting around Caen or the failure of Operation Market Garden at Arnhem, that same public profile could make relations with Allied commanders more awkward. Some American generals and politicians felt that he claimed too much credit or was too ready to criticize them, and Churchill at times had to calm those tensions and defend Montgomery in Parliament and in private meetings. Alexander's way of working in Italy was very different. He visited frontline units, went to briefings, and spoke with officers and small groups of soldiers. But he did not try to turn himself into a public figure. His staff did not push his image into the news. In wartime film and newsreels, when he appeared at all, he was usually a neat figure in the background, listening rather than talking. Inside the British High Command, views of the two men were mixed. Alan Brooke could be sharply critical of Montgomery's ego, while still recognizing his qualities as a corps and army commander. His picture of Alexander combined respect for his steadiness with doubts about his flair for very high-level strategy. Churchill, in private, came to a different balance. He later told his doctor, Lord Moran, and other close contacts that he rated Alexander as the best of the British commanders and placed him above Montgomery. At the same time, Churchill's political instincts, when he spoke in public or wrote about the war, drew him toward more colourful figures. In speeches and in his own history of the conflict, he naturally highlighted striking battles and strong personalities. Montgomery, with El Alamein and Normandy tied so clearly to his name, fitted that pattern. Alexander, more closely linked in the public mind to the retreat in Burma and the slow advance in Italy, did not. The effect was that inside the small world of the war cabinet, the chiefs of staff and the theatre commands, Alexander's views and reports carried considerable weight, while among the wider public his name gradually slipped behind those of generals whose campaigns were easier to turn into simple stories. If you look at where Alexander was sent during the war, the same pattern keeps showing up. In Burma, in 1942, he was sent to manage a retreat that many at the time feared might turn into encirclement and disaster. In North Africa, later that year, he was brought in to steady a theatre where British confidence had been badly shaken and to coordinate a complex campaign with American allies. In Italy from 1943 onward, he commanded a front that was important to Churchill's Mediterranean plans but never received the same resources as the main effort in Northwest Europe. In each of these roles, Churchill used Alexander to absorb pressure. Alan Brooke's diaries show how often the Prime Minister pushed for bold strokes and quick results in the Mediterranean. He floated new operations, asked why the front was not moving faster, and sometimes clashed with his senior soldiers over priorities. Alexander's written reports and personal briefings, as those diaries present them, tended to steady those expectations by spelling out what could actually be done with the men and shipping available. This did not put him beyond criticism. Even sympathetic historians have pointed to occasions where he may have given subordinates too much freedom, or where his plans, as at Anzio, involved more risk than the available forces could reasonably sustain. Others argue that in Sicily and early in Italy, he might have exercised tighter control over the coordination between British and American formations. From Churchill's point of view, though, one quality seems to have mattered most. Alexander did not panic, did not take his frustrations to the press, and did not let coalition tensions turn into open public quarrels. He accepted difficult assignments, reported progress plainly, and worked around decisions that did not go his way, such as Mark Clark's move toward Rome without starting fights inside the alliance. In practice, he often functioned as a troubleshooter for Churchill, not the main designer of new strategies, but the commander who could be sent into a difficult theatre with the expectation of a steady rather than spectacular performance. It was important work, but it was not the kind of role that usually makes a general a familiar name to the public. By the end of 1944, Alexander's responsibilities had grown even wider. In December, he was appointed Supreme Allied Commander in the Mediterranean, taking charge of the whole theatre while Mark Clark took over the Allied armies in Italy. At the same time, his promotion to Field Marshal was backdated to the capture of Rome, which ensured that he ranked ahead of Montgomery, who had been made a field marshal in September. In April 1945, as German forces in Italy finally collapsed, Alexander received the surrender of German Army Group C, formally bringing to a close the long Italian campaign he had directed for much of the war. After the fighting ended, his career followed a path that underlined how highly he was regarded in official circles. In 1946, he was raised to the peerage as Viscount Alexander of Tunis. That same year, the Canadian Prime Minister recommended him to King George VI as Governor-General, and Alexander held that post until 1952, becoming by most accounts a well-liked figure in a country still closely tied to Britain. Back in Britain, he later served as Minister of Defence in Churchill's government, before retiring from politics in the mid-1950s. Through all of this, he did not try to present himself as a dramatic war hero. His memoirs are restrained in tone. He tended to praise subordinates and allies, defended disputed decisions such as Anzio in careful language, and avoided attacking fellow commanders in print. Churchill, when he wrote his own history of the conflict, gave Alexander respectful coverage but did not make him as central to the story as some others. The big set-piece battles that shaped Churchill's narrative, the Battle of Britain, alamein, Normandy, naturally draw attention away from the slow and costly advance up Italy. The result has been that outside specialist histories, Alexander's name has become less prominent than those of some of his contemporaries. Within Churchill's immediate circle, the picture was different. The same sources that record Churchill's private comments, including Lord Moran's diary and later memoirs by those around him, repeat the view that he considered Alexander the best of the British commanders and rated him above Montgomery, while Alan Brooke's critical remarks about Alexander's limited strategic imagination show that even among the senior leadership opinions were not uniform. That combination of high trust and measured criticism fits the record of his service. He was not a striking battlefield innovator in the way some German or Soviet generals were, and he did not seek mass popularity. He made mistakes, and several of his campaigns remain debated. But he did repeatedly hold together difficult fronts under heavy political and military pressure. And he did it without adding new crises to the ones already on his map. If you look at Churchill, Montgomery, and Alexander together, you see three different patterns of leadership in a very large war. Churchill, with his spoken gifts and his liking for bold schemes, needed not just plans and divisions, but also symbols. And biographers say he understood that in a democracy, wars are held together by belief as well as by supply lines. Generals who could stand in front of a camera or a crowd and give a face to victory were useful to him. Many accounts suggest that Montgomery fitted that role. He inspired loyalty from some and dislike from others, but for the British public he became a visible champion, first in the desert and then in northwest Europe. Alexander did not work in that way. Writers who knew him describe a style that was almost the opposite of Churchill's. Quiet where Churchill was excitable, and restrained where Churchill was dramatic. And they say he preferred to let official reports and results speak for themselves. That difference helps explain why Churchill could trust Alexander deeply as a commander without building a public legend around him on the same scale as Montgomery. Some of the contrast comes down to personality, and some to the fronts where they fought. The slow, grinding campaign up Italy, with its river crossings, ruined hill towns, and disputes over Cassino, Anzio, and Valmontone, did not lend itself to simple stories in the way the Battle of Britain or the Normandy landings did, even though it was important in tying down German divisions and reopening the Mediterranean. The nature of coalition warfare played a part as well. As a commander responsible for British, American, and other Allied troops, Alexander could not easily fight public battles with his own subordinates. Biographers note that he kept disagreements over decisions such as Clark's move on Rome within the inner circle, and that this restraint helped preserve Allied unity while also keeping his own role less visible to ordinary viewers. The headquarters Alexander used south of Rome, with its maps showing lines driving toward Valmontone and then bending away, captures that contrast. In those rooms, he was central to planning a decisive blow under complicated limits, while in London, Churchill read his signals, weighed them against his hopes for Italy, and balanced them with pressure from Washington and Moscow. In newsreels and newspaper stories, however, it was usually other names that were pushed to the front. Over time, Harold Alexander became less the general, whose face appeared on posters, and more the figure a prime minister turned to when fronts were under strain and alliances needed careful handling. In a war where public image and politics mattered alongside operations and logistics, that kind of quiet dependability did not always bring fame. But in Churchill's view, it gave him something he valued just as much. A senior commander whose judgment and steadiness he felt he could trust even when he chose someone else to stand in front of the cameras.